The Astrology of 2020, the dawning of a new era. Hi, my name is Michael O'Connor, and I'm a professional astrologer and life coach. I created this video because clearly this is a very special year. The date alone suggests that. And it's not just the dawning of a new decade, it's the dawning of a new era, and I'll show you why. First, here's an overview of the core themes and events over the course of the year. We'll experience the influence of 7 eclipses. There'll be 4 major conjunctions. The lunar nodes will change signs. All planets over the course of the year will be retrograde. And the sign emphasis includes Aries, Scorpio, Capricorn, and Aquarius. They're the main signs, and the themes of which will be emphasized. This is not strictly limited to people with those sun signs. It's just a generic perspective. Now, before we begin, I'd like to just clarify a few points that will be helpful for you. Along the way, I'll educate you a bit about some key elements that are used in the language and practice of astrology so you don't feel so lost with, overly familiar dialogue where you think, I'm supposed to get this, but I don't because I don't have the background. So that will be helpful, I'm sure. First, when we speak of the transits, when we're talking about what the planets are doing at any given moment, we're referring to the transits. And these are also generally referred to as the astro weather. And it should be understood that this level of knowledge, this level of astrology, applies to us all generally, but not specifically. It's the generic perspective. It actually falls into the category of prophecy, where there's this universal, all-encompassing perspective, and nothing in particular for any given individual. It just so happens horoscopes stand between this more generic perspective and the more personal, where we look at how these transits apply to any given person. Horoscopes sort of actually aren't that powerful. They amount to maybe about 10%, and that would be probably generous, of the accuracy of what astrology can provide. But if you happen to be able to hit 100% on that 10%, then sensitive minds and people who are in tune usually recognize, yeah, this is speaking to me. That does make sense in my life. So horoscopes hold this very special intermediary position, and they work due to the holistic nature of reality, actually, and the principle of fractals. So we have this generic wide-angle perspective, which is sort of prophetic, and we just go, oh, well, the planets are here and this is what's happening. But until it's brought home to a personal chart, then it doesn't really mean much to us individually. It's intellectual, it's interesting, it can be fascinating, but it really does come home when we look at it as how the planets are connecting to our own birth chart, which was cast when we were born. Now, just quickly also that any country and state, province, territory, city, institution, company, every legal entity in the world actually has a birth chart. And that birth chart is created at the moment of signature or some special event. Usually it's a signature. This is called mundane astrology, the astrology of nations. You'll notice that when you go to a different country or even city or state or province, that it's very distinctly different, and it's always a question why. It's natural to assume it's due to its history and it's due to its geography and so forth, and those are certainly factors, but there's more to it than that. Each one actually has an astrology chart, and it's measurable and demonstrable how powerful that is. I actually have a video in the making that I'll be sharing soon that will show more clearly what this level of astrology can offer. Mundane astrology. It's called the astrology of nations. What's woven into this is what's called electional astrology. So where mundane astrology is kind of astrology for astrologers because of that level of understanding required to really get a good look at a person such as a country, in the eyes of the law. But electional astrology is more where we bring it home, and, for example, you signing a contract, when you do it is important, and we look at when. So the idea is to know prior to signing what signing on any given date might imply. Contracts of all kinds matter, especially those which are like a business, or if you're going to buy a house or something large with a long-term commitment. That's where it really, would be helpful to understand and be able to strategically say, hey, I want to enter into this legal long-term commitment on a good note. Can you help? And that's where astrology can help with electional astrology. So here, let's take a focus on the major astrological events for 2020. And it begins with the 7 eclipses. The first one actually is a solar eclipse that begins late in 2019, right on Christmas Day in the western part of North America. And for everybody else, it occurred on the day after the early morning of the 26th of December. So that first eclipse is, although it's one of the 7, it occurs late in 2019, but it's the waxing light of that eclipse which carries us over into 2020. And then there'll be a lunar eclipse on the 10th of January, and that's noteworthy partially because it happens a couple of days before one of the major conjunctions of the year, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which I'll elaborate on more in a minute. For now, though, the major other event in terms of solar eclipses this year includes a solar eclipse that occurs right on summer solstice and at 0 degrees Cancer, 21 minutes. Now, whenever you see 0 degrees activated by a particular event, it's good to take note. There's only 30 degrees in a sign, a 360-degree circle, a cycle, divided by 12 signs of the zodiac equal 30. So you never will see more than 30 degrees. So there's a principle in astrology called anaretic degrees. That means the planet that's at, or an angle that's at 0 degrees is one of them, and 29 is the other. So it's like the alpha and the omega. So the 0 is the alpha degree, and it's raw, fresh, full of potential, but green, inexperienced. So it's somewhat critical that way. And the very fact that we're going to have a solar eclipse right on summer solstice when the sun is at 0 degrees Cancer is very significant, and it will provide its own key event of energetically a turning point in the more generic sense. If you happen to have planets close to that degree on either side, the late degrees of 26 and later of degrees of any given sign, or the first 3 or 4 of the following sign of any sign of the zodiac, you'll feel the impact of that eclipse more fully, but especially if you have any angles or planets at 0 degrees, okay? So then there'll be another solar eclipse late in the year in December, and what's significant about that is that one of the bigger and major conjunctions of the year occurs right on winter solstice, but I'll get back to that in a moment. So we have all these eclipses, and solar are the main event, and I'll clarify that again further as we go along. So this solar eclipse that occurred right on Christmas Day, again for a lot of people, but for most on the 26th, but early in the morning, occurred at 4 degrees Capricorn 06. Just a little bit of a geek point there. But the main point is that some of you will know that, so you want to know that information. Most people aren't that aware of their astrology to that extent, so I'd like to provide that information for both all listeners in that regard. So January 1st, 2020, the stroke of midnight, the year begins, and when it does, the signs mentioned, the emphasized signs of the year, Aries, Scorpio, Capricorn, and Aquarius, are already activated. And they generally symbolize new beginnings for Aries, transformation for Scorpio, establishment for Capricorn or tradition, and revolution for Aquarius. Well, we see a lot of that these days, after all, in this dawning age of Aquarius itself. So, in fact, this dawning era is a very major, significant portion or feature, shall we say, of this age of Aquarius that's already dawned, but still in its early stages. Now, as the year begins, Mars will be in Scorpio, and that's quite significant. We can look at what's called the New Year chart, and that does really help lend a certain stamp of probability in a general sense for the year of what's going to happen, or the tone of the year is set. Mars in Scorpio is very potent, very passionate, but at worst it can be obsessive and ruthless and very, transformational all on its own. Mars is a co-ruling planet for Scorpio, so it's rather in an honorable position there. But Scorpio is very much about power and change and ambition. So just be aware that that is already going to have a big play on the year. Now, Mars also later in the year will enter its own sign of Aries and remain there for 6 months. That's noteworthy because Mars usually spent about 6 weeks in a sign. So when we see that it will be there for 6 months and in its own ruling sign, Mars particularly rules Aries and it co-rules Scorpio. So I have another theme of Mars, and Mars is all about the verb in the sentence, shall we say. It's the act upon action or taking action upon desire. The desires of Venus acted upon by Mars. So it can be very energetic, very assertive, certainly sometimes aggressive. It's not called the Lord of or the action or the god of war for nothing, Mars. So it's good to be aware of that. It's not something to be afraid of. It's in fact something to be aware of so we can harness its energy to our best ability. The fact that it will be retrograde for a good portion of this period of time is significant, but we'll just save that for another day. The main point is that it enters the sign and then halfway through turns retrograde, so it has to slow down, stop, go backwards, slow down, stop, go forward, and all of which takes 6 months, which is its usual rhythm, but sometimes it can traverse 2 signs, and it's been a long time since it did that in its own sign, and that's what the main takeaway is there. Now, also mention the lunar nodes will change signs, and I'm bringing this up right away, even though it'll only occur in May, and just because, well, the lunar nodes have an 18-month cycle, so it's not that rare that they change signs, and it's an 18-year overall around the zodiac cycle, by the way. So 18 months per sign pair. There's a north and south node, and the north node represents the future reach, and the south node is what we're letting go of. And what's significant about the south node in Capricorn is that it is the sign which will be very active this year. So it plays a role as well. It's part of the letting go of the Capricorn force that's been, which represents tradition and the establishment. So already we're seeing some of that revolution in the world in terms of what's going on in England with Brexit and how that's causing all kinds of waves and all kinds of directions, and then what's going on in the United States with Donald Trump and the whole impeachment process, etc. So there's just a lot of, and there's many other fronts which one probably could posit to see the synchronicities. But again, these synchronicities have to be looked at more specific levels, like the charts of those nations and those people in particular. So we're just being general at this point. Now, over the course of 2020, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto will all be in Capricorn. As a matter of fact, they already all are. But they will more fully in 2020 play a more significant role by virtue of forming conjunctions with one another. So let's just have a quick overview of what each planet in Capricorn looks like. So Pluto entered Capricorn way back in 2008, and it will be there till March 2023. So we're still fully in the process of that transformation that Pluto represents in Capricorn. And it's very much a societal transformation, and it's linked to the economy and government structures, and all traditional institutions really will experience the full pressure and weight of that. Now, what's important to note and remember is back in 2008 is when we experienced the economic, crash, and we've been in that recession ever since. And subsequently, the real estate market has pretty much tripled. Airbnb has come along and grown exponentially and caused a lot of waves and influences in the economy, especially with rental markets. So there's a real housing crisis in the world right now due to that, and the economy is under a lot of pressure due to the real estate and the housing issue all over the place. Some places certainly worse than others, but it's just a good example of how it's synchronized exactly with the timing of Pluto entering Capricorn and how that kind of really represents an epicenter event that is still underway and hardly fully resolved yet. Now, Saturn in Capricorn, it began back in 2017, late December 2017, and will remain there until late December 2020. So a 3-year cycle. So it stays, Saturn, in its own sign a little longer than other signs. An average is about 2.5 years. Now, Saturn is the ruling planet for Capricorn, so we regard that as an honorable place for it to be. And it refers to themes like traditional power structures, ambition, worldly, authoritative, organized, practical, realistic, disciplined are some of the key words for both Saturn and Capricorn. So both get reinforced. So positively, what's happening with this is that a lot of people have and are responding to the economic crisis by being more, determined, more disciplined, more focused than they would have been otherwise, and that's one example of Saturn in Capricorn. Now, Jupiter in Capricorn is the late arriver, and it began in early December 2019 and will be there until later December 2020. So just 1 year for Jupiter in a sign. Now, Jupiter, contrary to how Saturn is in Capricorn, which is favorable, admittedly, Capricorn, by the way, is sort of stoic and stodgy and kind of heavy and serious and conservative in many ways. So it's not altogether a picnic having Saturn in Capricorn, but it does represent sort of a powerful potential at best. Now, Jupiter in Capricorn is a little bit more complicated because it's not a easy sign for Jupiter to be in, because where Jupiter is all about expansion and risk, Capricorn is about contraction and a much more calculated approach. All right, so they're sort of antithetical to one another. Now, what it can manifest is kind of a complicated aspect, really, for just the cycle of Jupiter through the sign of Capricorn. And it only does it every 12 years. So when it does, it's sort of a complicated period, but it's the foundation of it being in that sign, then also making important conjunctions with both Pluto and Saturn, which I'll explain in a moment. So it can manifest as a ruthless drive for power, is one of its kind of expressions in a more negative sense. It can also indicate the corrupting influence of power, power for its own sake being sought. And it can also lead people to, emphasize the letter over the spirit of the law, which really means, dogma or fundamentalist thinking. Positively, there is a positive side to Jupiter in Capricorn, by the way. It could really lead to a very upstanding and integral approach where respect, trust, integrity, honesty, and an ethical approach to business and social affairs can be really activated. So there's a positive. It's always important to recognize that nothing's ever pat in astrology. It all is relative to how it's expressed and by whom, and all circumstances, every case must be approached and judged on its own ground. Very important to make that clear. So, some might come along and make rather grandiose statements about what something means, but it never means anything particular and final. You really have to apply all factors to each individual. And remember, the individual can include the entire country or the entire state, province, or city, as much as it can any given person or individual person. So always remember that. And people who sort of make grand proclamations, it's sort of a bit of sensational, a bit of exaggerated drama, attention-seeking, you might say, and it's a bit dishonest and not very professional in my view. So it's important to always remember how planets will influence us is relative, and it's a major theme within a more responsible application and expression of astrology. Now, over the course of 2020, there'll be 3 major conjunctions. The first one is Saturn conjunct Pluto, which occurs on January 12th. The next one is actually a triple conjunction, so we'll count it as one major conjunction, but it happens 3 times. All right, it's a little bit of a twist of perception, but Jupiter will be conjunct Pluto 3 times over the course of the year, beginning in early April, then late June, then mid-November, and all occurring in Capricorn. Now, so far, what's already interesting about that is the Saturn conjunct Pluto in Capricorn occurs at 2246, and the 3 conjunctions of Jupiter to Pluto in Capricorn later in the year occur from 2251 to 2453. So very close proximity to one another, Saturn and Jupiter conjuncting Pluto by degree points. That's very significant, and it's a major understanding to recognize. Saturn will come in early and form that conjunction with Pluto, and it will create its own impact on whatever points it touches. Again, referring to individual charts, persons, nations, people. And so we need to understand, and I'll get back to that in a bit. Now, Jupiter conjunct Saturn occurs late in the year, right on winter solstice, it so happens. So we'll have a solar eclipse on summer solstice, very significant, very potent, but also right on winter solstice 2020, there'll be this major conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn at 0 degrees Aquarius, that alpha degree, that critical degree, once again. So that's a big takeaway to understand. That really is the key event for the new era, but it's more complicated than that, and I'll clarify that as we go along here. So, by the way, conjunctions equal new cycles. In astrology, there's all kinds of aspects. We're referring to aspects. They're the relationship between the planets, okay? Now, just briefly, when a new cycle begins, of course, an old cycle ends. It's always a good little understanding. That's the bit of takeaway there, that it means we're at the end of something, at the beginning of something new. Now, briefly, aspects in astrology, once again, include the major aspects. There's 5 major aspects. So they include conjunction, square, opposition, sextile, and trine. And this is how the planets, when they're in aspect, they interact. They're dynamically involved with one another, and they tend to influence each other mutually. This is really important to understand. One of the things I want to clarify here is that there's a lot of attention being focused on, this Saturn-Pluto conjunction in a sort of negative way. And it definitely can prove to be a very destabilizing event, but not necessarily negative. It may activate positive aspects in your chart or in a country or city's chart. So just as is generally true, there's always a full spectrum of events always occurring where some people are going through great hardship, other people are winning the lottery. And it could really, this is where some people don't really believe in astrology, but it's because partially they're not really seeing it on a case-to-case basis. They're seeing it more generically. They're allowing the prophetic perspective, the generic perspective to play a stronger role than it should. Okay, it's a little lack of understanding of the deeper implications of the subjectivity. Now, one more layer of understanding is that when we look at the planets in astrology, in our solar system, we recognize that the personal planets include Sun and Moon, which are actually luminaries. They're not really planets, but we include them. We're generally categorized as among the personal planets. And then Mercury, Venus, and Mars. Then the social planets include Jupiter and Saturn, and then the transsocial planets include Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Now, I do quickly mention there's an asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and then there's Chiron that sits between Saturn and Uranus. We won't emphasize those right now. They're important in astrology, but we're not going to get into it. The main thing I want to bring attention to at this moment, I just want to give you a bit of a categorization of how the planets are in 3 groups, personal, social, and transsocial, and bring special attention to Jupiter and Saturn as the social planets because they are conjunct Pluto in Capricorn over the course of 2020. And that's important because that means, as I mentioned, when you have an aspect between any 2 planets, they play on one another. So Saturn will, play on Pluto, and Pluto will play on Saturn. So it goes both ways. It's not a one-sided dynamic. They interact and engage, just like, a couple of tennis players playing at each other. They really back and forth at each other, and it creates different kinds of results at different stages. Very important to understand the stages of the process, and it's where astrology doesn't just measure something that happens suddenly and it's over and that's it. It's more it's like a video, like life, the ongoing story, and the steady stream of things unfolding, but we take snapshots, we take photographs, and that's when we can talk about those, and it's very interesting and can be very insightful, but the story goes on, and it's always a process. So now the fact that this combination of conjunctions over the year with the social planets Jupiter and Saturn to Pluto produces some powerful complexities, and it generally can be understood as global social change. All right, the end of old cycles and the beginning of new cycles. So that's really important, and a lot of astrologers are bringing attention to this in that very way. Now, let's bring more focus then to Saturn conjunct Pluto. On January 12, 2020, this event only occurs every 34 to 40 years. It's a bit of a jog in amount of time because Saturn has a 29.5-year cycle and Pluto has a 246-year cycle, and it's an elliptical orbit for both as well. So that means elliptical means when it's in each planet are in different signs, they move a little faster or slower than compared to other signs. Okay, so that elliptical orbit principle. Planets are always moving in a more accelerated or decelerated rate of speed due to that elliptical orbit, so they're never at the constant speed as would maybe be assumed. Now, by the way, the last event of Saturn conjunct Pluto was way back in 1982, and the next one will be in 2054. So we're seeing the end of that cycle that began in early November 1982 and will enter into the whole new cyclic process that ends in 2054. So it's sort of a mini era. It's not what I'm focused on when I say this is the dawning of a new era. The new era I'm referring to is much longer than that, but this is a small but major chapter within it, by the way. Now, back in 1982, it just so happens that there was some positives with Saturn conjunct Pluto, like the first CD player was sold. Now, that was positive for many people, but it was kind of negative if you were selling vinyl, records at the time. The Times Magazine man, quote unquote, of the year that year was the computer. And look what's happened to the world since that time, since 1982, between then and now. Wow, not only have computers entered into our lives in a very big way, but so too has the internet been launched. So we live now very much in a computer age, and then at that time we did not. It was not a computer age at all. So yeah, of course, 3.5 decades later, it makes sense, but it's important to recognize the synchronicity of what occurs within any time period. There also was a major recession that started in the United States at that time. Now, this is just one of the charts. There's only a couple of these at most in this presentation. And what I wanted to bring attention to in particular was the fact that this is Pluto and this is Saturn here, very exactly conjunct at 2246, but it just so happens on that very day that the Sun is less than a degree away on one side and Mercury is less than a degree away on the other. So there's 4 planets involved in this conjunction. Well, again, the Sun isn't really a planet, but we call it that in general terms. Now, there's a lot to be said about this, and it very much points, by the way, to both the environment, the whole climate change story is major, but also it's linked directly to social justice, by the way. Those 2 main points. And it's not a big surprise because the whole climate change and environmental issue is very global social and affecting people personally, and there's a lot of course, concern about that, but also it's directly linked to justice, that, it's not fair that it's not addressed, for example. that, companies just proceed along business as usual, and, governments too, without really paying close attention as much as they could or should, certainly in the minds of many people at least. So if we look closely at this chart, I'm just going to offer you a few more points. It does suggest that, humanity at worst, it may be said, has sort of lost its way. And old traditional power structures have, it's not their fault, it's nobody's fault, but we're at a place where we need a new level of vision, a new level of heroism to emerge. And this chart does suggest humanity as a whole is kind of undergoing what can be called a bit of an identity crisis. And, we're forgetting what's important, but we are, increasingly reminding ourselves, and we're coming around the corner to realize, just like health, let's say wealth without health doesn't amount to much value. The same is true of the global economy and so forth. If the environment is decaying and we're being poisoned by it, we're poisoning ourselves, and so on, well, what's the value? The quality of life goes down significantly. So very much about that principle of a healthy environment leads to a healthy world. Okay. So now, this aspect, Saturn-Pluto conjunction on January 12th, can be quite destructive, by the way, at worst. If it's forming strong aspects in your chart and making difficult aspects to other points as well, it'll be very complicated. So it always depends on the chart. You really have to know it on a subjective, person-to-person basis to know how it will affect. Okay, I said that a few times now. I want it to be really clear. There's nothing pat about it. Can't grand proclamations and predictions that are all encompassing really doesn't apply well, and it actually gives astrology a bit of a bad name because it's just too generalized. It doesn't really hit home in a personal way, because we can posit examples of it, other people having great times or really good cycles or really at the high point where others are having hard times. Always good to remember that. So now on the positive side, it can give birth, and probably will, to new norms. Now remember, it's an event that begins a cycle that begins in 2020 but ends in 2054. So it's a long period of time, and there'll be a lot of sub-cycles that occur within that time, by the way. Now, but giving birth to new norms, new methods, new approaches, new trends, attitudes, and traditions. Yes, indeed. I mean, this is always happening. Look at history. If we think of the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, every decade has its own special something about it. And, so we can use that. It seems to work very nicely, in fact, that every decade is very significantly something else. So we are talking about 2.5 decades from now, so a lot can happen in that period of time. But, the world is changing quickly. A computer age and, moreover, an artificial intelligence age is on the rise, whether we like it or not, unfortunately. And this invariably is producing, waves of change and revolution within society. Now, other negative possibilities could be due to a certain amount of earthquakes occurring both in the social arenas, politically, but also more literally, could cause, a lot of disturbance. So there are definite possibilities, not certainties, but, because Saturn, Pluto are in an Earth sign, we can definitely imagine that this might manifest in a very geophysical way. But it can also cause, if it happens socially or even geophysically, invariably government steps forward and, becomes more authoritarian in some way. So we should be aware of that very real possibility. Now, there's a bit of a tower principle behind Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Tower in the tarot is a principle, well, it has two sides. One is sort of a destructive fall from grace, a demotion, sort of a ruin principle. Okay. It can definitely manifest that way, but on the high side, more positively, The tower can indicate a completion, a renovation process, a graduation, and an initiation process. I use that word once again with emphasis because, yeah, it's always good to understand that the tarot can be quite cryptic, and it takes a lot of wisdom to really understand the fuller implications of, what's revealed there. It's amazing that it works, and it does. But it can, all depends on how it's used. It can really create a black and white kind of good and bad mindset. And modern astrology no longer thinks or functions that way at all. It has matured to realize that such fatalistic thinking is really a thing of the past. And increasingly, from all sectors of society, the emphasis on free will is important. But we should take note that while that's true, we have free will and it is powerful, we still do have a destiny, both on a national and larger level, but also individually. And astrology is the study of that as well. So powerful process of change that is social is the main thing Saturn-Pluto indicates as a conjunction. And keywords like transformation, death and rebirth, destruction, but also reconstruction are important words. And then this phrase here, I use this implosion principle of Saturn compressing and Pluto representing power could, produce an implosion of some sort. So that's kind of a negative, admittedly, but we should be aware of that very real possibility. So now, throughout the year, now that's Saturn, Pluto, early in the year, and it's been getting a lot of airwaves, a lot of attention, and it symbolizes a cyclic process of, 34 years in this case. And so a lot will happen during that period, of course. And it will prove very revolutionary. It's destined mostly to contribute at least to the establishment of a whole new societal structure on the planet. It so happens, especially with the introduction of AI in particular. And, of course, that's directly linked to 5G. And all of these occurring alongside with the whole climate change issue. Wow, the world is not boring at this time. It's a little bit, scary at worst. And navigating through all of these major dynamics happening at collective and global levels is where astrology can help a lot. Now, the main point here is that Jupiter, again, could serve for its part, it will expand Pluto's power in Capricorn. So that could be sort of a more governmental thing on one hand. However, sometimes it depends on the chart, but really reinforce personal power at a whole new level. So it can boost it significantly. And it, linked to an increased resolve and discipline towards self-improvement or regeneration. So just be aware of the value of the possibility of harnessing this energy. Again, proactive versus reactive, possibility versus fatality, or, a fatalism, I should say. Now, so Jupiter, Pluto, big expansion that way. It also is, remember, as mentioned earlier, Jupiter and Saturn conjunct Pluto works both ways, where Saturn will contract the power and Jupiter will expand the power, actually, in a manner of speaking. On the other hand, Pluto, being the planet of transformation, will have a strong impact on Saturn and Jupiter, which are the social planets. That's why you get, that's why it'll manifest as significant social change, both eventfully, like in the short term, but also as a process over time. Now, late in the year, Jupiter and Saturn will finally, in December, leave Capricorn and enter Aquarius on the heels on the 17th and then the 19th of December 2020, and then by the 21st will form that conjunction. So just wanted to point attention that they both will exit the sign just literally a couple of days apart, which is rather interesting because Saturn's been there since late 2017 and Jupiter only entered in early December or late 2019. So it's kind of an interesting rhythm that they're having where they'll conjunct together closely in Aquarius, having just entered it. So that's rather significant over the course of 2020. So now what's really important about this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, by the way, remember, they will leave Capricorn and they enter the next sign, Aquarius, and they will do so right on winter solstice. Very, very significant statement, very significant event. And they begin a 20-year cycle. Now, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions tends to be understood as an economic cycle. And so let's look a little closer at this cycle that they share. Now, looking back a bit, Jupiter conjunct Saturn has occurred in Earth element signs 8 of the last 9 times, okay, 20-year cycles each, since 1840, always in Earth signs, except for one of those 20-year cycles. It began in air sign Libra. Okay, and then this year in 2020, at the end of this year, winter solstice, it occurs in Aquarius, another air sign. So what's important about that is we can see that the repetition of the conjunctions through an element, a significant one of the 4 elements in astrology. There's just earth, air, and fire, and water. And they're very significant, of course, the understanding of the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual themes of life are very woven into that principle. Now, more specifically, though, the era of Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in Earth signs, beginning in 1840, you'll see this nice little rhythm. It goes Capricorn, Virgo, Taurus, Capricorn, Virgo, Taurus, then Capricorn, Libra, Taurus, Libra being the neighboring sign to Virgo. So it has this little jog in it. It's rather interesting. It does that every time. So what we're getting at here is that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is the era we're talking about, okay? And we are just therefore on the final year now of it, they as a pair in Earth signs, all right? And the cycle since 1840 of Jupiter-Saturn conjuncting in these Earth signs has manifested as a whole new global economy and infrastructure where science, technology, and engineering in particular have created the world we know today. So it's all within that synchronistic time frame that we can say, wow, yeah, amazing how much the world has changed and how much all of the modernization, industrialization has laid the foundation. And now we have, everything from a debt economy and credit cards and electronic money and everything, and all of this high-level technology and engineering infrastructure not only established, not only has it created the world we see now and experience, but it's also the foundation for the new era. Make no mistake, that's important. That's the key message. So 9 of the next 10 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, by the way, beginning on winter solstice 2020, will be in air element signs. One of those 20-year periods, the conjunction will occur in Scorpio, and that only in 2160. So between 2020 and 2220, that is the era I'm referring to. So the Jupiter conjunct Saturn in air signs begins, it has this nice rhythm. Once again, you can see it, Aquarius, Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, Scorpio, Gemini, and then the final one in 2200, Aquarius. So that little anomalous jog, there's probably a worthwhile discussion to be had among astrologers, quite frankly, to decipher what does that hold, what implication. I see it as a bit of a foreshadow for the next cycle. It provides that, and sure enough, not a big surprise that during from the last conjunction in 1980, when Jupiter Saturn were conjunct in Libra, it brought forth in that time period, that 20-year period, the computer age. So, and now it re-entered in 2000 an Earth sign, Taurus, and since then we've adapted in the material world to that whole new computer age that we're in. So that was the interesting foreshadow period it provided. So we'll just trust there's a rhythm of understanding there. Now, by the way, the air element, principle and theme is different than Earth. So where the Earth has established this science, engineering, infrastructure, potential, and reality, but also potential for the future. We can include architecture and design, of course, in those terms. But the air element is much more focused on, social, intellectual politics, themes like humanism, justice, and the dialogue debate principle of what's right, what's best. And so this is just a bit of a collage of images that reveal everything from the rise of the UN to international dialogue to the gender revolution that's going on and still will for the entirety of this century, but stands to be resolved within the scope of this era. In other words, before 2220. In fact, I do a presentation that's already on my YouTube channel that shows a lot about that. It's called the Uranus-Pluto cycle and the gender revolution. So the Uranus-Pluto had a conjunction back in 1965, and they'll have their next conjunction in 2104 to be exact, and that comprises its own very key important cycle during which time the gender revolution will be resolved. But we are also dealing with a whole new level of equality and justice linked to all sectors of society, all subgroups. Everybody counts, everybody matters, everybody has a right and a reason to be here, and not allowing old traditional prejudices and dogmas to get in the way of, accepting that people have their own individual needs, choices, and destinies, and that they don't fall within tidy lines of what social dogmatic thinking and religious often tends to impose. In other words, where religions even to this day will not only accept but not allow somebody who's, let's say, homosexual to be homosexual. They're against that, and it's sort of a very contrived letter of the law as opposed spirit of the law principle, and that's what we mean by dogma and fundamentalism. It's not a good thing. Also here, so we have this themes, all these kinds of themes of social justice, fairness, equality, that will be major themes within the course of this 200-year era. Okay, so we're really creating a world for all of us. That's the goal. Now, it should also be understood that air signs are quite intuitive, and we stand to also develop more collectively a telepathic capacity. I will slide that in theoretically, but I think it's true. But I'll leave that one alone. It's all part and parcel with the age of Aquarius, by the way, which is the larger backdrop. And by the way, I do another presentation that elaborates all of these themes even more, but such a long-winded discussion that I decided to do this faster one. So in this period of time, already social debates abound. And, there's a lot of, as is life, there's a lot of media involvement, and it can, set everybody's in business. So sales and spin are a part of the game. And so already we see a big, debate with, global warming versus global cooling, and there's two sides, and each side are saying, well, the science says, we're really left to wonder what science are we talking about here. So the climate change issue is heated right now. It's a big one, but it's just an example of this air sign emphasis, this new era, where Aquarius is very much, we can use terms like revolution, humanism, and democracy. Libra is all about equality, justice, and liberalism, and Gemini, communications, perceptions, and interpretations. So it's all about the recognition there with the Gemini that, our perceptions and interpretations aren't necessarily fact. They will be communicated, but to assume that we see life as it is where we're really challenged. It's where the Libra comes to the fore, where it says, well, let's be a bit more careful and look at all sides. So there's lots to say about this, but this is just an emphasis on the whole era we're entering into in 2020, late in the year, admittedly, so 2020 very much is a build-up towards this new era. Okay, so, and that's where the Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto conjunctions in Capricorn, the sign of society, structure, tradition, or, how the norms of society are subject to change this year. And, but again, remember that these conjunctions will begin new cycles. One of them will be a 24-year cycle, and 34-year cycle, and that's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So make no mistake, while a lot stands to occur in 2020, and definitely on personal levels, in the larger scheme of things, we're looking at the bigger picture that, wow, we're entering into this sort of era, which mostly I'm referring to as the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which will occur in air signs over the course of 200 years. But this, 34-year cycle, for example, is a very key feature of it. And of course, there'll be several of those before it's all over, the 200-year period. But the first one is the emphasis for now. So let's just have a quick look. So that's a quick look at that. Wow, 2020, what a big year. These major conjunctions, 3 of them in particular, which represent the end of old cycles and the beginning of new ones that are very strongly emphasizing societal change. And before the year is over, especially with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, entering a whole new series of conjunctions in air signs, we see the dawning of a new era. All of this in this new decade, this year 2020. So, we begin to wonder, well, wow, what does this mean for me? How does this, come home on a more personal level? And the thing, as mentioned earlier, is it always depends on your chart. And it should never be assumed in a general way at all. And in every case must be judged on its own ground, as mentioned. And so we have to look at, how these transits are applying to your chart. And in astrology, by the way, when it comes to prediction, we're looking at a lot of other techniques. There's a lot of techniques in astrology to measure the future and what's in effect manifests or represents the probability factor. In this day and age, more and more than ever before, really, there are a lot of sectors of society emphasize the importance of free will. At worst, it does so at the level of assuming that it's only about free will. That is an illusion. I will say with confidence here. No, life is on purpose. We live in a conscious universe. You do have a destiny. Your destiny actually, in many ways, is to be fully you. But with the astrology, we can look at more precisely, what does that mean? How can sometimes it's about being more individuated, sometimes being, evolving in certain ways, etc. So it's amazing how wonderful the psycho-spiritual insights offered from astrology can be. It's really just such a powerful tool. Now, just the main thing to understand regarding our own, and collectively, but our own personal story, is that solar eclipses are the main event. Regarding the 3 eclipses, the first one already here in late 2019, and then the 2 over the course of the year, one at summer solstice and the other one in mid-December 2020. The solar eclipses are the main event. They usually manifest as outer synchronistic events of some kind, if it's your destiny for that to occur. Make no mistake of that phrase. It's nothing random. It's not arbitrary. Circumstances in our lives do play a role, it is true, and sometimes it's not us but somebody close to us that's undergoing the effect, so therefore we're drawn into it. Okay, of course, that's a very natural understanding. Lunar eclipses are more internal, emotional, subjective. They can be important, certainly, especially if they touch upon very key points, but they're subtle and more subjective, so not outwardly evident. So now, the 3 major conjunctions, the main point to understand once again is we saw those before: Saturn conjunct Pluto, Jupiter conjunct Pluto 3 times, and then Jupiter conjunct Saturn, which is the dawning of the new era. But let's look a little closer at these. The main thing here is that Jupiter and Saturn conjunct Pluto in Capricorn occurs within the span of 20 to 28 degrees, especially of the cardinal signs, Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, and Libra. They're the 4 cardinal signs. In astrology, there's 3 modes: cardinal, fixed, and mutable. The 12 signs divided by 3 equals these 4 modes. Modes are like kind of more actional, where if you divide the 12 signs by 4, you get 3 signs of earth element, 3 signs of air, 3 of water, and 3 of fire. So that's a way of, it's just an interesting division of 3 times 4. That's very significant to the whole principle of astrology. The main point for now is that if you happen to have planets anywhere in any or angles in your chart from 22 to 24 of any sign, you will experience the impact of this major conjunction between Saturn and Pluto early in the year. Now, remember, it's not necessarily negative, but it does generally mean it's powerful. The lead up to it should already be there if you happen. You will already be seeing and sensing the change, but not necessarily. It does depend. Some people are more perceptive and intuitive and attuned, and others a little less. Nobody's better than anybody else, but some have certain advantages, of course. So the main point here is that that conjunction, will occur from 20, especially 22 to 24 degrees in particular. So you want to be aware you might have a planet or angle, but that's where astrology comes and we can help you to understand that better. Now, the same is true of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which at the bigger level is the dawning of this new era, but it can be also understood on a more personal level to affect us anywhere from 27 degrees of any sign to 4 degrees of the following sign. So there's a bit of a span of any, but specifically 27 of cardinal and 4 of fixed signs. Cardinal being, again, Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, and Libra, and fixed signs are Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. So lots to consider there, but now it always, again, comes back to how is this going to affect me? And these are the questions that aren't easily answered because we really have to look at your own birth chart. So it comes down to understanding the bigger picture. I mean, there's always things going on. And even though major years like 2022 mean a lot to us all collectively, sometimes on a more personal level, it's not as big an impact as other years, which might be socially, globally, not so exciting, but they're big to us. So again, as mentioned right at the get-go, there's nothing pat about it. And you have to really approach every case on its own ground, and the application of astrology is what that's about. So there you go. There's some insights to understand why 2020 is such a major year, not just the date alone suggesting a new decade, but wow, there's a lot more going on in this year. It will, in fact, be the dawning of a new era of especially air sign element emphasized due to Jupiter-Saturn conjuncting in those signs for the next 200 years. Major. But in the short term, we have 2020 to focus on, and every year is important and every day is important. So I invite you to contact me, and I'll be glad to help you understand who you are better, why you're here, and where you're at and where you're going, what's next. All of those types of questions, and bringing special emphasis to the current cycles and whether or not they're making major impact on you this year or not, and others as well. So thanks for being here, and trust you got some great insights from all of this, and look forward to meeting you and speaking with you in the near future. All right, all the best in 2020, and thanks again.